Somewhere in a basement laboratory in Jena, Germany, in 2017, a team of geneticists cut open a sample tube containing powdered bone from a 3,000-year-old Egyptian mummy. They had been told for decades that this would not work, that the hot climate of Egypt destroyed ancient DNA, that mummies were too contaminated by embalming chemicals to yield usable genetic material. They tried anyway. They extracted DNA from 151 mummified individuals buried at a site called Abusir el-Meleq along the Nile in Middle Egypt. They recovered mitochondrial genomes from 90 of them and full genome-wide data from 3. When they compared the results to modern Egyptian populations, the answer was so unexpected that it reignited a debate that has been raging for over a century. The ancient Egyptians were not who we assumed they were, and modern Egyptians are not who they were either. The two populations are genetically different in ways that no one had proven until this study put the numbers on the table. I came across this paper while following citations on Neolithic migration patterns. I expected it to confirm the conventional picture. It did not. It redrew the entire genetic map of one of the most studied civilizations in human history. Start with what everyone assumes. For most of modern history, the identity of the ancient Egyptians has been claimed by opposing camps with equal confidence. One side argued the ancient Egyptians were fundamentally an African civilization, rooted in the populations of the Nile Valley and connected genetically to sub-Saharan African populations. The other side argued they were closer to Near Eastern or even European populations, pointing to artistic depictions, trade networks, and linguistic connections to Afro-Asiatic language families originating in the Levant. Both sides built elaborate cases from art, language, skeletal morphology, and historical context. What neither side had was ancient DNA. For decades, it was considered impossible to extract usable genetic material from Egyptian mummies. The climate was too hot, the preservation chemicals were too invasive, contamination risks were too high. The question of who the ancient Egyptians actually were remained unanswered at the molecular level. It stayed that way until 2017. Consider why this question carries so much weight. Ancient Egypt is not just another civilization, it is arguably the most iconic in human history. The Great Pyramid of Giza stood as the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. The Sphinx has watched the sunrise over the Sahara for 45 centuries. For the 19th and 20th century scholars who first excavated these sites, there was an implicit assumption baked into the work. A civilization this advanced must have been built by people who looked like them. On the other side, scholars from the African diaspora pointed out that Egypt sits on the African continent, that the Nile flows from the heart of Africa, and that the earliest Egyptians depicted themselves with dark reddish-brown skin in their own tomb paintings. The argument became political long before it became scientific, and it stayed political because no one could test the actual bones. The study was led by Verena Schwennemann at the University of Tübingen and Johannes Krauss at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History. They sampled 151 mummified individuals from Abusir el-Meleq, a burial site in Middle Egypt that had been in continuous use from roughly 1400 BC to 400 AD. That is a span of 1,100 years, covering the New Kingdom, the Late Period, the Ptolemaic era under Greek rule, and the Roman occupation. If foreign conquests were going to leave a genetic footprint, this was where you would find it. From those 151 individuals, the team recovered mitochondrial genomes from 90 and complete genome-wide nuclear DNA from 3. The results were published in Nature Communications under the title Ancient Egyptian Mummy Genomes Suggest an Increase of Sub-Saharan African Ancestry in Post-Roman Periods. The title itself contains the revelation. The ancient Egyptians at Abusir el-Meleq were genetically most similar to ancient populations from the Near East. Specifically, they clustered closest to Neolithic and Bronze Age populations from the Levant, meaning modern-day Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, and to Neolithic Anatolian farmers from what is now Turkey. They shared more genetic ancestry with these Near Eastern groups than with any modern or ancient sub-Saharan African population. Modern Egyptians, by contrast, carry substantially more sub-Saharan African ancestry than their ancient counterparts. The shift happened after the Roman period, likely driven by increased trade, migration, and the trans-Saharan slave trade that intensified in the centuries following the Arab conquest in 641 AD. Wolfgang Hauck, group leader at the Max Planck Institute, put it directly. The genetics of the Abusir el-Meleq community did not undergo any major shifts during the 1,300-year time span we studied, suggesting that the population remained genetically relatively unaffected by foreign conquest and rule. I want to pause on that because it overturns a common assumption. Alexander the Great took Egypt in 332 BC. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled for nearly 300 years. Cleopatra herself was of Macedonian Greek descent. The Romans administered Egypt for centuries after that. And yet the DNA shows that none of these occupations meaningfully altered the genetic composition of the local population. The conquerors ruled, they built temples, they collected taxes, they installed governors and generals. But they did not replace the people. The Egyptian population absorbed its rulers, not the other way around. That genetic resilience across 1,300 years of foreign domination is one of the most remarkable findings in the entire study. What this means is that the civilization that built the pyramids, developed hieroglyphic writing, and constructed the temples at Karnak was populated by people whose closest genetic relatives were not in sub-Saharan Africa and were not in Europe. They were in the ancient Levant. The founding genetic stock of ancient Egypt appears to have been closely related to Neolithic farming populations that expanded out of the Fertile Crescent thousands of years before the first dynasty was established around 3100 BC. A full genome sequence from an Old Kingdom individual dating to roughly 4,500 years ago showed a profile of approximately 80% North African Neolithic ancestry and 20% ancestry from the Eastern Fertile Crescent. The people who built the Great Pyramid at Giza were genetically rooted in a population that had been in the Nile Valley since the Neolithic expansion. Now here is where the modern picture gets complicated. The study showed that today's Egyptians carry roughly 8% more sub-Saharan African ancestry than the ancient mummies did. That is a significant genetic shift occurring within the last 1,500 years. The most likely explanation is the trans-Saharan trade routes that brought millions of people across the desert over centuries of Arab and Ottoman rule. But the key point is that the ancient population and the modern population are measurably different. Modern Egyptians are still the closest living relatives of the ancient Egyptians. The Coptic Christian population of Egypt, which has historically had lower rates of intermarriage with incoming populations, appears to retain the highest proportion of ancient Egyptian ancestry among modern groups. But even the Copts have shifted compared to the mummies that Schwennemann's team tested. Johannes Krauss addressed the political dimension directly. He said some people claim that foreign domination following conquest from Alexander the Great, the Romans, or Assyrians, changed the gene pool of ancient Egyptians and made them more Eurasian. What we observe is, however, quite the opposite. The ancient population was already Eurasian shifted before any of those conquests occurred. The genetic closeness to the Near East was not the result of Greek or Roman colonization. It was the baseline. It was who they were before anyone invaded. The Egyptians themselves seem to have understood this. In the tomb of Seti I, painted roughly 3,200 years ago, they depicted the known world as 4 distinct peoples. They painted themselves as reddish-brown. They painted Nubians to the south as dark-skinned. They painted Asiatics to the east as lighter-skinned, and they painted Libyans to the west as pale. They did not see themselves as belonging to any of those other groups. They saw themselves as their own category. The DNA suggests they were right. This is one of the most consequential genetic studies ever published on an ancient civilization. And it did not resolve the debate so much as reframe it entirely. The ancient Egyptians were not what the Eurocentric model claimed. They were not what the Afrocentric model claimed. They were a Northeast African population with deep genetic roots in Neolithic Levantine and Anatolian farming communities, and they maintained that composition with remarkable stability across more than 1,000 years of recorded history. The DNA does not belong to any modern political argument. It belongs to the people who were buried at Abusir el-Meleq 3,000 years ago and who carried within their cells a record that outlasted every dynasty, every conquest, and every claim made on their behalf by people who never tested the bones. Paul here. If this one hit different, subscribe. The next one reaches even further.